Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning to learn with Rabbi Rosensweig and our Kehillah Rina Israel as we study the issue of the Petur of Miztaer on Sukkot. I want to thank Marilyn and Joseph Bench and family who are sponsoring Rabbi Rosensweig's shir this morning in commemoration of their mother's yard sites. Rachel Bench, Zichron Bracha, Rachel Bas, Harab Shlomo Yekutiel, Zalman's 25th yard site, and Leah Salmon's Zichron Bracha, Leah Bas, Moshe Aryeh's 10th yard sites. As we prepare for Yom Kippur and for Sukkot, the issue of Miztaer is something which is very much on our minds, because one of the critical points about Yom Kippur is that there's an element of tsar that we experience on Yom Kippur, and this is something which is meant to bring us to a certain place. And on Sukkot, we have an opposite in position, or an opposite direction, that of Samachta b'chagecha. And as we engage in these issues, it's interesting to think about the fact that among the details of the Petur from Sukkah is that there are times where one's learning itself is also a basis by which a person can be exempt from Sukkah. The type of learning that they're engaged in would be interrupted by the experience of the Sukkah. So that too is also a place of tsar as well. But today, as we have the opportunity to learn with the Rosensweig, the opposite of tsar. It's an opportunity to really be nana from the Torah, to be able to enjoy and to appreciate the opportunity to learn Be'iyun, an important sugya that will get us ready for the Chagim that are before us. Rabbi Rosensweig.
Thank you very much, Mr. Outler. And it's always a pleasure to be here and to participate in the yard sites of the Bench family. And as was already mentioned, the shir is in memory of Rachel Bas Harav Shlomo Yekutiel Zalman, 25th yard site, and Leah Solomon, Leah Bas Moshe Aryeh's 10th yard site. So it's always very special to participate in these yard sites, and the Sukkot of the Divrei Torah should be, something that accrues to those who we remember. It's always a little strange to speak about, Sukkot in advance of Yom Kippur. Superficially, it seems that way anyways, and initially that's our response. We're all, in a state of agitation, in a Seres Tshuva, preparing for the day of, Mr. Alka mentioned, being Nisan, that's not Shal Seichem, and already we're looking forward. But from another perspective, the truth is that the connection between Yom Kippur and Sukkot is really an important theme in its own right. It's partly the theme of this particular topic. And therefore, it's not as if we're skipping Yom Kippur. On the contrary, there could be no Sukkot if there wasn't first a Yom Kippur. But I think it's also true, and I'm going to begin with this, there could be no Yom Kippur if not for the fact that we anticipate it's being followed up, it's in some respect engendering the holiday of Sukkot. The relationship between Yom Kippur and Sukkot is so inextricably connected that indeed it partially explains the phenomenon that we are addressing. So let me go straight to the question, and then we'll circle back a little bit. The Mishnah in Masechet Sukkah discusses actually Gemara Sukkah. That would be good. It's always good to have. I have a Chumash, but it's always good to have Gemara Sukkah too. The Gemara in the Mishnah in Masechet Sukkah, on Daf Chaf Hei Amud Aleph, discusses some of the salient details of sitting in the sukkah and yeshiva b'sukkah, which is really a very unique kind of experience. And one of the things that it establishes right away, thank you, is the fact that there are exemptions. Oh, okay, these complicated gemaras. There are exemptions that apply to sitting in the sukkah that don't seem to parallel our knowledge, other mitzvot. The Mishnah says that shluchei mitzvah Petur min sukkah. If somebody is a shliach mitzvah, he's exempt from sukkah. Normally, shlichei mitzvah are not exempt from achilas matzah, and they're not exempt from tkiyah shofar. And to the extent that shluchei mitzvah are exempt from anything, the truth is that, thank you, you know me well. To the extent that, shluchei mitzvah are exempt, in general, it, is based on the application of more general principles of, halachic triage, if you want to call it, namely what happens when you have a clash between, two different halachic factors or principles. But in the Mishnah here, shluchei mitzvah are exempt from the sukkah as not a general principle, but obviously something very, specific to sukkah itself. We're not going to discuss the details of that at the moment, but cholin u'mishamshehem are also pturim min sukkah. Those who are ill and the people who attend to them are also exempt from the sukkah. Now we're aware of the exemption based on illness in other contexts, but typically that is in the case of what we call sakanas nefashos or pikuach nefesh. Again, a very important theme on Yom Kippur and on Shabbos and in Kol HaTorah Kula, frankly. But as the Gemara explains, when we talk about cholin u'mishamshehem, we're actually talking about a chola she'ein bo sakana, as we'll get to in a moment. And then we continue reading in the Mishnah. We're told that ochin v'shosim arai chutz l'sukkah, also very interesting halacha, topic in its own right, and that is that even though you're supposed to eat and drink and also sleep in the sukkah, apparently there's a difference between more casual behavior, arai, and keva. Somehow, if the Mishnah is an integrated principle, that difference between keva and arai is also connected to the very unusual exemptions of shluchei mitzvah and cholin u'mishamsheim. But the Gemara then elaborates this on daf. We have in the Marmakomos, the Gemara on. One second, I'll give you my page number. The Gemara it's on page 3. The Gemara says cholin u'mishamsheim. I think I have what you printed out, so it's probably hopefully it's the same thing. Yeah. Okay, good. We're on the same page, literally. It's towards the top of the page, the second entry on that page. The Gemara says, Tan Rabbanan, Chola Sha'amru, is what I was referring to. Lo Chola Sheyesh Bo Sakana, not somebody who's in grave danger, whose life, is being threatened. Ella Pilu Chola She'ein Bo Sakana, even somebody who, who's we're talking about illness, and obviously it's more than Chosh Barosho, it's more than somebody who has a headache. Or something more trivial. So it's something which is, something to be concerned about and definitely to address. Typically, this is a category that we call, mutal b'mishkav or something of that sort. Somebody who can't continue his routine. He has, an illness that disrupts that and needs to be addressed. But again, in, Kol Torah Kula, we're talking about, mitzvos doraisa, biblical commandments. There is no exemption typically for a chola she'ein bo sakana. So when the Gemara identifies that is the case, this stirs the discussion of the Mefarshim. I'm not going to go into this part of it right now. Some of them discuss whether or not maybe there aren't other areas also in halakha which are sensitive to the status of chola she'ein bo sakana. We know that when it comes to violating or allowing one to ignore, mitzvos d'Rabbanan or shvusim on Shabbos at the category of chola she'ein bo sakana, but chola is very important, amir la'akum and other things. But the obligation to sit in the sukkah is a biblical obligation, and therefore this is very surprising. And then the Gemara goes further and says, "El afilu chola she'ein bo sakana, afilu chosh be'einav, afilu chosh barosha." So that doesn't mean something mechush bi'alma, it means something a little more than that. But obviously, the Gemara is extending this Petur. And then the Gemara says, Omar Shimon Gamliel, Pamachas, Chashti be'enai b'kaisari. He had some sort of, difficulty in his vision. or he felt pain in his eyes. V'hitir Rabbi Yossi Berebi, right? Lishan aniu mishamshai chutz l'sukkah, and he asked the Shalom, and the ruling that he received is that it's permitted for him to sleep, and not only him but his attendants, those who are going to help him. It's permitted for them as well to sleep outside of the sukkah. Rav Sharel Ravacha Bardala Lemigna Bekilsa B'Sukkah Mishum Baki. Baki is some sort of some people say it's mosquitoes or other annoying bugs. So there were bugs in the sukkah. That can happen, and he allowed them to use some sort of a covering, which according to most Mefarshim mean that they really weren't sleeping in the sukkah, meaning they were in the sukkah physically, but they weren't legally in the sukkah. That was the only way to protect them from these annoying bugs. But that, of course, is already not even chola she'emo sakana. That's just something which can be extremely annoying, as we can all attest, but it's still not chola. Then the Gemara says, Rava Sharli and Ravacha Ba'ada, Lebigna Barmi Metalasa, another case where there was permission given to leave the sukkah mishum sircha de gargishta. Again, the details are not a certain bad odor or something else. Rava l'tamei, as the Gemara explains, Amar Rava Miztaer Petur minasuk. So while the words Miztaer doesn't appear in the Mishnah, this is where we encounter this principle. Miztaer, if a person is in a state of pain, difficulty, he's suffering in some way, that he is exempt from the sukkah. Then the Gemara says, but didn't we learn that if a person's a chola, we just said that means even a chola she'emo sakana, right? He's exempt from the sukkah, but that's a step up. That's an upgrade from Miztaer. So the implication of the Mishnah, right, would be that if you don't achieve the threshold, at least of chola she'emo sakana, that you should be obligated in the sukkah. Chola in Miztaer lo. So the word is challenging, in other words, whether or not this exemption of Miztaer is also justified. Says the Gemara, Amri chola hu mishamshav Petur. Miztaer hu patur mishamshav lo. This is a very interesting distinction. So the Gemara says that if somebody's a chola she'emo sakana, not only is he, but the people who attend him also are exempt, even though they're feeling fine. Okay, and he's not in sakana. Nonetheless, being connected with a chola she'emo sakana is sufficient basis for being exempt from the sukkah. And if the individual is a Miztaer, that doesn't excuse his attendance, but he himself is also exempt from the sukkah. So the Mishnah speaks about chola she'emo sakana, okay, drachim. The Gemara extends it to Miztaer with a distinction. But what emerges, of course, is these exemptions, which seem to defy the canons of biblical obligations, of mitzvos, more generally. Then the Gemara goes further. The Gemara has a very interesting discussion of that Chapei Omid Beis, where the Gemara says, Gufa, Amrav Abba Bar Zablin is the next entry in the Mar Makomos. Avel Chai B'chol Mitzvos Amuros Batot. The Gemara that appears in a bunch of places, in Brachos, Sukkah, Ksubos. So the Gemara says that an Avel, a person who is mourning, he is obligated in all mitzvos, chutz mitfilin, with the exception of tefillin, the beginning of his Avelos. Shari Nemar Bahen Pe'er, Bidom L'Rachman L'Yichazkel Pe'ercha Kabush Alakha, right? Atu de Mechaybas, Avakula Alma Petur. He said, you are obligated to Yichazkel, but to everyone else, the implication is that normal people, typical mourner, would be exempted. Then the Gemara continues and says, Amarav Abba Barzav Marav Avel Chayim B'Sukkah. Just said that an Avel is, all things being equal, obligated in mitzvos. And now we're just being, very more specific, or at least trying to preclude some sort of a misconception. And we're being told that an Avel, a mourner, is obligated to sit in the Sukkah. Says the Gemara Pshita, we just said, Avel Chai B'Kol HaMitzvahs. Says the Gemara, Mao D'Seiva. I might have thought, Miztaer, Petur, Minasaka. Since we have this rule that somebody who is suffering, who's uncomfortable, is exempt from the Sukkah. Hainami Miztaer, who he may not be physically uncomfortable, but he is, of course, psychologically, in a state of distress, and therefore that maybe should qualify as Miztaer as well. Says the Gemara, Kamash Malan. Therefore, the Brisa is telling you, Hani Militzara Demimela, that there's a difference between, Tzara Demimela, typical case of Miztaer, based on hard to know what the criteria. Certainly, the classic cases that have been discussed in the Gemaras and Sukkah are all cases that have to do with the physical environment. There are bugs, there's an odor, right? There are all sorts of, environmental, let's say, aspects. Is that the only thing included in Tzara Demimela? We'll get back to that. Aval Hacha, but in the case of an Avel, Ihu Udim Komitztair Knapshe, he, Begavra, his circumstances, he's in a case of tsar, psychological distress, right? But that's not called Tzara Demimela, and therefore Iboile Liyasube Dait. He's obligated to overcome it. The Gemara is very ambiguous in terms of what this definition of Miztaer is, and we'll get back to that a little bit later on, based on our analysis. Anything but environmental issue does not qualify for Miztaer. One possibility. Or maybe especially Avelis on a Yom Tov, right, where there's an issue whether or not there is Avelis, frankly. Basically the Yom Tov wipes out part of the Avelis. There's no active Avelis. So maybe that is what the Gemara has in mind. We'll get back to this. There's a range of views. Meaning, he might be in psychological distress, but the halacha actually wants him, to override and to overcome that. Or maybe something else. Maybe the idea, we'll get back to all these later on. Maybe the idea is that it's true that he is in distress, but typically, when somebody's Miztaer, most in the environmental Miztaers that the Gemara has, right, there's always a better alternative. Namely, he can always, go into his home. And in that respect, both that alternative and maybe, also the definition, meaning this is not the place for him right now. There are bugs here, there's odors here, there's a discomfort here, and maybe that's a problem. Maybe a sukkah that is by definition uncomfortable or that, engenders distress by virtue of where it is, especially in contrast to the home, that's a problem. However, in the case of Avelus, it would appear, again, that maybe that's what the Gemara has in mind. We'll see all these interpretations and more, but we don't have so much time, so we'll see more. But the Gemara says, Ihu hu dekam Miztaer nafshe, meaning Tzara Demimela, the environment, and therefore it defines the environment. There's an alternative. Each of these, as independent or one or the other. But in the case of an Avel, right, his psychological distress is internal and very personal, has nothing to do, presumably, we'll see, with the environment in which he's in. And therefore, he doesn't benefit from a different environment. And this isn't caused by the environment, and it doesn't reflect necessarily the environment of the sukkah. And therefore, Ihu hu dekam Miztaer nafshe, Ibai liyasube dait. So there are different possible ways of reading the maskana of the Gemara. The fact that the Gemara initially thought that you would apply the din of Miztaer to an Avel is surely very significant, basically is what I'm saying. And we, have to examine very carefully because of the ambiguity. What does the Gemara reject here? Does it reject, the idea that anything but the environment of the sukkah doesn't qualify as Miztaer? Or is this something about Avelis B'Yom Tov? Is this something about the relationship to the alternative? All of this we'll have to examine. What emerges, though, for a moment, this is before we go into more detail, is that there is a Petur Chol Hashem Sakana, there's a Petur Holchei Drachim, and most important for us for today, there's a Petur of Miztaer, all of which, as I say, do not have an analog, mostly in biblical imperatives, in mitzvos, we call it Tarukum. There's some discussion about Miztaer in the context of tefillin, but we're not going to get into that right now, although I'll make reference very quickly to it later on. Why does Sukkah have these unusual dealings? So Rabbi Strauchler, definitely alluded to part of this discussion in his brief introduction. I think that there can be three overlapping perspectives on Miztaer. The first one has to do with the very unique status of Sukkot, as a Chag. And I believe that is definitely connected to Yom Kippur, which is why this is a good pre-Yom Kippur topic, because the contrast between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, as I alluded to at the outset, is not merely a contrast, it's really a transition. And from that point of view, it's also an important perspective. What typically, most cultures perceive as a contradiction, the halacha embraces in a much more complex and subtle and integrated way. Namely, the relationship between Yira and Simcha in halachic terms is really a close one. Ivdu as Hashem b'simcha, Ivdu as Hashem b'yira. And that comes to the fore in various contexts. In Yom Kippur itself and in Sukkot itself, there's aspects of Simcha on Yom Kippur. You read the Sefer Chinuch and Rabbi Yonasan, the discussion of Zman, sugyas in Masechet Kindness, about the joy of Yom Kippur, Mara Kohen aspect. There are different perspectives on how expansive or limited it is, but there are certainly important manifestations of Simcha on Yom Kippur. And the last words that the Torah addresses to us about Yom Kippur in Parshas Emor, I should move away too much because we have Zoom people. So the Torah's presentation, which we'll get to in just a second, of Yom Kippur is very, very fascinating. It begins in Perek Chav Gimel with Pasuk Chavav and Chav Zayin, which we'll get to in a second. But the last Pasuk, which we have here also in front of you, on page 1, I reproduced some parts of Parshas Emor. If you look at Pasuk Lamed Beis, Shabbat Shabbaton Hu Lachem, V'nisam es nafsho sechem, B'tishal lechodesh ba'erev, me'erev ad erev, Tishbesu Shabbatchem. So we'll get back to this pasuk, but if you look at Targum Yonasan ben Uziel, he adds the words, bechedva, which is very fascinating, meaning that this v'nisam es nafsho sechem, and the erev ad erev tishbesu Shabbatchem is done b'simcha. Now, on the surface, v'nisam is the opposite of simcha, Rabbi Strauchler mentioned, although it should be noted, this is not for now, except very briefly, and that is that when the Torah presents v'nisam es nafsho sechem as a leitmotif in all of Yom Kippur, both in Achremos and in Emor and in Bamidbar, it's interesting to note, the Gemara discusses this in Yom Daf Pei Aleph and Aleph, that there is no lav to fast on Yom Kippur. It doesn't say anywhere you can't fast, you can't eat, and you can't drink on Yom Kippur. Those, of course, you can't eat, you can't drink on Yom Kippur. I want to make it clear. But in the Torah, it's formulated as a positive obligation, being Nisam Esnaf Shosek. And the Gemara, and Peyalef from Aleph and Yoma, wonders why this is. The Gemara says, where is the lav? Obviously, it's a severe onesh if you don't abstain from eating and drinking, right? There are, intentionally, there's a severe, punishment for that particular transgression. So the Gemara itself says, where's the lav? And then the Gemara initially, says, well, there was no way to write this lav. Very strange. I mean, the Rebbeinu Shalom, he wrote the Torah. It's all Shemosav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's Shivin Panim LaTorah. People have been darshaning it, and they add to the explication of it, find new insights in it, for thousands of years. But somehow the Gemara is telling us initially that the Rebbeinu Shalom didn't have enough ingenuity to figure out how to formulate in Hebrew that there is a prohibition to eat that would have been precise and accurate according to the laws of Yom Kippur. Very straight. The Gemara itself abandons that, after a while. And the Gemara suggests that there's a kind of a virtual lav, which the Rambam formulates in the beginning of Hilchos Shvisas Asar. Reb Sajagon, probably Kedarko, only counted a mitzvah aseh b'nisem. But I think the bigger point is, from my point of view, when you take a step back, is that there may be a virtual lav, but the Torah still abstained intentionally from formulating v'nisem esnaf shosechem in a negative way. And that's because the nisem esnaf shosechem on Yom Kippur is an opportunity. It's not a punishment. I mean, there are different perspectives. There's a korban aspect to it as well, according to Chazal and many of the Mefarshim. But in addition to that, there's a certain headiness in the ability, right, to rise to the occasion, right, and to, I like to say, kind of outdo the malachim, in establishing your capability, our capability, the Jewish people's capability, for pure spirituality. What? And therefore? No, but it's not, that's the consequence, but there's no, the Gemara is concerned, where is the lav, right? You don't have a lav. In the end, the Gemara says, ein onshin elen kain mazhirin. So, and that's what the Rambam, paskins too, or the learned from Hekesh from another V'nisem. So in the end of the day, we say there's the Rambam counts a virtual lav in Sefer Mitzvos and the Koteret and Hilchos Shvisas Asar. What I'm trying to say is, however, in the end of the day, it's not acceptable to say the Rebbeinu Shalom couldn't figure out how to write it, right? So there has to be some sort of an explanation why the Torah itself, even though it severely punishes. So if you ask, so what's the severe punishment for? The answer is severe punishment is not capitalizing on the positive opportunity, right, to establish, right, your credentials in terms of being Nisam Esnaf. And that fits in very well with what Targum Yonasan ben Uziel is telling us, and that is that when we extend V'nisem, which we do, that's the last pasuk in the presentation of Yom Kippur, namely, we say Shabbat Shabbaton Hilachem V'nisem Esnaf Shosechem Me'erev on Erev Tishbeshu Shabbatchem, which is understood, bigger topic also, as Tosefet Yom Kippurim, and we're pointing to the Rambam specifically in the area of V'nisem Esnaf Shosechem. It's there that Targum Yonasan says Bechet. So I think it has two meanings. On Yom Kippur itself, there are many expressions of joy, even though fundamentally, obviously, the main or the primary motif on Yom Kippur, what we mostly encounter and what we mostly internalize, and our motivation, which may ultimately bring us an attainment of Simcha, is the aspect of Yira and Pach, as we'll discuss in just a second. And that, of course, is expressed in the more obvious interpretation of V'nisem Esnaf Shosechem, Itzumo Shoyom, the V'havadati, the fear of Kares, etc. But on another level, the chedva of the Targum Yonasan is already a reflection that there's going to be a transition into the next holiday, that of Sukkot. So I'd just like to take a minute just to look at the psukim to try to show that when the Torah presents Yom Kippur, and when it presents Sukkot, it does so in parallel opposite fashion. I would say that the two most unique presentations in Parshas Emor relate to, the most unique is certainly Yom Kippur. It's the most unique day of the year. And second to that, the most enigmatic, most fascinating is Sukkot. And I think that they parallel themselves in a certain way because they are both complementary, but complementary as parallel opposites. When it comes to Yom Kippur, we can go to the psukim here on page 1. The Torah begins by Dabar Shema Moshe Lemor, that part's okay. Ach ba'asar lachodesh. The first word is ach. I'm going to do this quickly because we're not focusing on Yom Kippur. I just want really to focus on Sukkot. The first word is ach ba'asar lachodesh hashvi hazeh Yom Kippurim hu mikra kodeshi alachem v'nisim esnaf shasechem v'ikravtem yishev Hashem. In that first pasuk, we already have the word ach. Ach is a jarring word. It sets Yom Kippur off from all of the other chagim. There's no. It's as if to say Yom Kippur is unique. It's different. In what sense is it different? Many respects. If you look at the Ibn Ezra, the Sforno, I think I did produce the Sforno here, probably on page 5. Yeah, the Sforno says, "Ach b'atzar lachodesh hashvi'i," pasuk Chav Zayin, is on page 5. "Afal pisha b'shar mikra kodesh roi l'smoach v'lisaneg gam b'achilo shtia kamro ichlu mashmanim shtu mamtak," even shulchan manos le'nachon lo, which of course is even Rosh Hashanah. Ki kadosh hayom la'adonenu, the pasuk in Nehemiah. V'kol makom b'asar lachodesh hu yom ha'kippurim lizvados u'lisonin gever l'chata'ad ve'eno yom simcha v'tanug avul yom inui ka'amaro, and so on. Meaning, the word ach, Rashi says, quoting the Gemara in Masechet Shavuos, that ach means Yom Kippur is effective, but only l'shavim, not to einam shavim. That's based on the Gemara. But some of the later Mefarshim, including the Ibn Ezra, the Sforno, and others, think that the ach, has a bigger meaning it's as if to say this is a unique, this is a different chag than any other the chagim. But it's interesting to note that if you look now, we're going to be going back and forth. The Torah has two presentations of Chag HaSukkos, right? One is right after Yom Kippur, and that's pretty routine. However, as is well known, when the Torah seems to conclude Parshas HaMoadim completely, it went through the entire cycle. It starts with Shabbos, right? And then it, starts with Chag HaMatzot, Pesach, Chag HaMatzos. Sequentially, it ends with Shmini Atzeres. So then it's as if it all starts all over again, right? So it's, if you look here, by Dabar Hashem b'Moshe, this is pasuk Lamed Gimel. Dabar b'nei Yisrael b'chamisha asayim l'chodesh hashvi hazeh Chag HaSukkot shivat yamim la'Hashem b'yom harishon mikra kodesh kol malakas avodah lo sasu. All of that is pretty routine, as I'll explain in a minute. Then comes pasuk Lamed Tes after Elam Odei Hashem. This is Lamed Zayin. Asher tikra so mikra kodesh la'akriv yishel Hashem. Right? Ola mincha zevach l'sachin v'yom b'yom. Luvad shabsos Hashem. Luvad matnosechem. Luvad kol nidrechem. Luvad kol nidvosechem asher tidnu l'Hashem. Meaning, this is the summary of the entire Parshas HaMoadim, all the korbanos and all the days. So that's it. No. Pasuk Lamed Tes through Mem Daled is a second parsha about Sukkos and Lulav. And how does it begin? With the same word, ach, which draws, of course, our attention. If you look at the Sforno, and the Ibn Ezra, again, they are very consistent. They noticed it there. They noticed it in the other one. Look on page 5. We talked about all the generic dinim of the Moadim. The Zeb Meshakula Mikrai Kodesh, Utinim Korban Musaf, right? Ka'omro Elamod Hashem Asher Tikro Tzom Mikrai Kodesh LaAkriv Vayisha. Omar ach b'chamisha shenodia shechag HaSukkos nibdal misharamo. Right? Why? And then he brings the example. It has an eighth day, which no other thing has. It has a shinui dira. It has a daled minim. The details are not important. The Sfarno in both cases is saying that the word ach is a way of the Torah accentuating this is different. So there are two different moed, right? And they're both expressed in the same way. Other Mefarshim say that what's different about the ach is exactly the parallel opposite of Yom Kippur. Namely, if Yom Kippur is a day which emphasizes, Vi Nisim and Yira, of course, Chag HaSukkos is a time which emphasizes Usmachtem. Usmachtem, Hashem Elokechem, Shivas Yamim, which we'll get back to. In Yom Kippur, after the Ach of Yom Kippur, the Torah goes on to do something very remarkable. It's spoken about this in years past. It says, Ach basar Yom Hashvi Yom HaKippurim, Mikra Kodesh Yelachem B'Nisim Esnaf Shosek. So typically, in all the other Moadim, a little bit Rosh Hashanah is different, but not so much. The word Mikra Kodesh is always connected to Isur Malach, because this is the parsha of Mikra Kodesh. Ela Moadei Hashem Asher Tikro Son Mikra Kodesh. Right, the common denominator, the ubiquitous feature of every Moed is Isur Malach. The one exception, real exception, is Yom Kippur, and this is true in the other parshios of Yom Kippur as well. It's very inspiring, the consistency. If you look in Bamidbar and you look in Achrei Mos, right? So the Mikra Kodesh of Yom Kippur is connected to V'Nisim Esnaf Shosei, and the Isur Malach of Yom Kippur is connected to Ki Yom Kippurim Hu, as if to say, well, every other Moed has some sort of a generic, framework of Yom Tov, which is patterned after Shabbos. Yom Kippur is like Shabbos, not because of a framework, right? But because it's Yom Kippur. Meaning everything about Yom Kippur is fundamentally Yom Kippur. There's nothing, that's borrowed or shared. I would say nothing, mostly with other Moed. When it comes to Sukkot, so in the first parsha of Sukkot, we start off like we typically do in all the other Moadim, which is Bayom HaRishon Mikra Kodesh Kovalecha Savoda Lo Sasu. But in the second parsha, right, the one that begins with Ach, what's striking is, to me, I haven't seen anybody else make the comment, the word Mikra Kodesh doesn't appear at all. In the parsha of Mikra Kodesh, the last gasp, if you will, the final second parsha of Sukkah, there's no word Mikra Kodesh at all. You have Shabboson, which is actually a word that appears in other Moadim too, but is particularly prominent regarding Yom Kippur, which of course is Shabbos. So it's Shabboson, it's Shabbat, two Shabbosons actually in Pasuk Lamed Tes. Interesting about. Sure, if I'm making too much, but Shabboson, Ubiyom Hashmini, Shabboson. There's no Mikra Kodesh. When it comes to Yom Kippur, the Torah speaks about Yom Kippur as a day of Lifnei Hashem, and it also provides a bit of Tamei HaMitzvos. If you look here in Pasuk Chavches, V'kol malacha lo sasu be'etzem hayom hazeh, ki Yom Kippurim hu, l'chaper alechem lifnei Hashem Elokechem. So the phrase lifnei Hashem Elokechem, and a key, an explanation, almost like a half Tamei HaMitzvos, or Darshin and Talmud Dekra, you find in this pasuk. In the second rendition of Chag HaSukkos, again, you have Lifnei Hashem Elokechem, pasuk Mem, V'lekachtem b'chem b'yom harishon pri eitz hadar kapos t'morim anaf eitz avos arvei nakal, u'smachtem Lifnei Hashem Elokechem. And then, of course, in pasuk Mem Gimel, you have an even more explicit Darshin and Talmud Dekra, Tamei HaMitzvos, whatever you want to call it. Pasuk Mem Gimel, L'man yedu dorosechem, ki b'sukkos hashavti es b'nei Yisrael b'otzi al son, the Eretz Mitzrayim, ani Hashem Elokechem. So both of these parshios are singular, and in my, opinion, my estimation, they are singular in a parallel opposite way. They're different in some respects, but they touch on the same phenomena not only in an opposite way, there are some other, I mean, again, there's no, the Mikra Kodesh of Yom Kippur is specific, not generic. In the case of Sukkot, there's a generic one, and then there's none at all. There are differences that still need to be accounted for, but our eye is certainly drawn when we read one parsha to read the other. So when we consider that one is a day of Nisan Asnav Shoseka, and the day of obviously Yira and Pach, Rambam in Hilkos Chanukah very famously, when he wants to explain why it is that there's no Hallel in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, uses the phrase, if you look here, this is on page, page 5. Is it 5? Yeah, page 5, very famous. If you go, the Rambam speaks in Hilchos Chanukah, of course, about Hallel. And on the third line, Aval Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim, ein bahem Hallel, l'fi shehein yemei tshuva v'yira v'fachad, lo yemei simcha yaseir. That's the phrase that the Rambam, formulated. He didn't copy this from anywhere. This is his own, very specific analysis. And in Pirush Mishnayos in Rosh Hashanah, he says it, I think, in an even more forceful way. But that's not important for now. So this phrase that the Yemei Tshuva B'Yira V'Pachav Lo Yemei Simcha Yisera is very unique to the Rambam. Equally unique to the Rambam is his characterization of the holiday of Sukkot. So if you look here on page 1, this is the Rambam at the very end of Hilchos Lulav. The Rambam says, even though there's always an obligation to, express simcha on a moed, right? I should add that the Rambam omitted Yom Kippur from the moed, meaning the Rambam deals with Yom Kippur in Hilchos Shvisas Asar, immediately after dealing with the beginning of Sefer Zmanim is Shabbos, then comes Eruvin, then comes Shvisas Asar, which is about Yom Kippur. I'm not going to go into all of that. And then comes Hilchos Yom Tov. And in Hilchos Yom Tov, he lists the Yomim Tovim, and he omits Yom Kippur, which he dealt with in Shvisas Asar. Of course, the Shulchan Aruch, the Tur and Shulchan Aruch didn't do that. Right? They dealt with Yom Kippur after dealing with Rosh Hashanah in the context and after dealing with Hilchos Yom Tov. It's a very interesting choice. Meaning Yom Kippur is in the Parsha of the Moedim, right? But for the Rambam, its Shabbos Shabboson status is kind of more salient, than its presence inside the Moed. So when he says, it's not like you could say, he means, Rov Rubam, but not Yom Kippur. He's not referring here to Yom Kippur at all. The Chag HaSukkos Haisa Sham B'Mikdash Simcha Yisera. That's also the Rambam's original phrase, as far as we know. Now, Simcha Yisera, and then when you remember Ein Bohem Simcha Yisera, there's actually a technical, problem. Say Ein Bohem Simcha Yisera and something that Simcha Yisera. What about the in between? But I'm less interested in that at the moment. But in terms of formulation, resonance. It resonates very clearly with us that these are days of Simcha Yisera, and those are days Ein Bahem Simcha Yisera, right? Again, I'm putting them on the same sheets. The Rambam diffuses his treatments of these topics, throughout Yad Chazaka. Shenemar, Usmachtem L'fnei Hashem Elokechem Shivas Yamim. The Ketzad Hayu Osin, and then he talks about Erev Yom Tov Arishon, Yimatakni the Mikdash, Makom L'Nashim, L'Malav L'Nashim. The whole concept of Simchas Beis HaShoeva, and then Halacha Yud Gimel, Heichais Simcha Zu, and then Halacha Yud Daled on page 2. I'm sorry, Halacha Tezvav. He has a very beautiful peroration, very beautiful depiction of Avoda B'Simcha, specifically here in the end of Hilchos Lulav. HaSimcha she'yismach Adam ba'asiyas hamitzvos u'ba'avas hakel she'tziva bahen avoda gedola. The kol hamoneh atzmo b'simcha zu roi li'fara mimenu Shenemar tachas asher lo avantas Hashem lokacha b'simcha b'tov levav. V'kol megis data b'cholek kavod li'atzmo miskabed be'enav v'mekomos elu chote v'shota al zeh hisir shlomo al titadar melech l'fnei melech v'kol amash b'latzmo meko gufa b'mekomos elu gadol v'chubad oved be'ava kein david melech Yisrael amar v'kalosi od mizos v'yisi shatel be'inai ein gdula v'kavod elu smach l'fnei Hashem. So this, of course, at the end of Hilchos Sukkot, this is maybe the most forceful formulation of the Rambam of the concept of avoda b'simcha, and it comes specifically in the context of Chag HaSukkos. The Rav Zatzal used to suggest that these end last Rambams in Hilchos Lulav aren't really so much about Simchas Yom Tov of Sukkah per se, but that they are a little bit more particularly connected with Simchas Yom Tov of Sukkah in the Mikdash. And way back, there's already a piece in, the Kovetz Chidushei Torah, one of the few things, that came out in the early years. He makes this suggestion and this point. In other words, this isn't about Simchas Yom Tov of Sukkah per se. It's a Mikdash kind of dimension of Simchas Sukkah. However, I just like to reformulate that a little bit in an important way. Of course, it's about Simcha in the Mikdash on Sukkos, but instead of being a Mikdash din on Sukkos, I think it's clear that the Rambam holds that it's a Sukkah's din that is particularly more acute in the Mikdash. Number one, the fact that he formulates his halacha in the end of Hilchos Lulav and not in Hilchos Tmidin, Musafin, the right place in Sefer Avodah. Indeed, the Rambam generally thinks that the role of the Mikdash when it comes to the holiday of Sukkot, isn't just a Mikdash din, but a Chag HaSukkos halacha. That's very apparent from the fact that he formulates the mitzvah of lulav. If you look on the page 2, Rambam Shofar Sukkah Hagdama, he says Lito lulav b'mikdash kol shiva simei achad. So this is often not fully appreciated, and same in Sefer Mitzvos. When the Rambam formulates the mitzvah of lulav, he formulates it in terms of 7 days in the mikdash. But again, this is not in Sefer Avodah. It's in Hilchos, Sukkah and Lulav. Mitzvahs Lulav v'inato b'yom rishon shokad b'vad b'chol mokom afilu b'Shabbos u'b'mikdash levado notlin b'kol yom v'yom b'shiva yemei achad. By formulating in Sefer Zmanim that the Ikar mitzvah is Zayin Yomim in the Mikdash, the Rambam is telling us that this is fundamentally a din in the Chag, the most acute expression of this simcha, which is part and parcel and defines the Chag, happens to be in the Mikdash. And consistent with that is his decision not to so much place Simchas Beis HaShoeva as Yerushalmi and others do in the context of Nisa Chamayim in Sefer Avodah, but based on the pasuk of Yismachtem right here. Moreover, the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvos, Mitzvos Asay Nun Daled, also here on page 2, this is the Rambam's general formulation of the mitzvah of Simcha B'Regel. L'smoach, Hisha Tzivanu l'smoach b'Regel. Hu amar Yisale, D'samachta b'Chagera. So if you look down, and you go down 3, 6, 7 lines, the Rambam, when he's describing Simcha B'Regel, not even on Sukkot, says, V'liskok b'kli nigun v'lirkod b'mikdash levad b'simchas Beis HaShoeva. V'zeh kulo niknas tachas amaro v'samachta v'chagecha. Which is fascinating, because Mishnah Torah says, V'smachtem b'fnei Hashem Elokeichem Shivat Yom. But my point is as follows. If the din of Simchas Beis HaShoeva, which the Rambam is addressing, is the paradigm of Simcha, of Avodah B'Simcha, was a din in, Simcha Sukkah B'Mikdash, then it doesn't belong as exemplifying Simchas HaRegel. It sounds like the Rambam saying is there's a concept of Simcha HaRegel that's even more acute on Sukkot, where it's Simcha Yisera, And it's even more acute on Sukkot in the Mikdash. But what happens in the Mikdash, whether it's on the Lulav side or the Simchas Pesach Shoeva side, on Sukkot, all of that, right, is just a more, clearer and more acute manifestation of Simchas Hareg. So for the Rambam, Chag Sukkos represents the apex of Simchas Hareg. And indeed, this is reflected in his perspective on Lulav as well. The Rambam Nichus Shofar Sukkah Lulav Perek Zayin Halacha Yud talks about when you take the Lulav. Ketzad Molech U'Menanea Rosh Halulav Shlosh Pamim U'Mevi Menanea Rosh Halulav Mechein Ba'aliyah Yirida Dehechan Molech U'Mevi the Shas Kriyas Ahala Hodol Hashem Kitov. So Rambam says that is our practice, that you should take the lulav during Hala. Rav Zatzal used to explain that unlike the Balitosis, who seem to think that the Nanuim in Hallel, Tos and Sukkah, are really a din in Hallel. You're saying Hallel, and here you have the opportunity to kind of integrate this other feature that will, accentuate even more, the Hallel opportunity moment, like to expand Hallel. The Rambam, on the other hand, the connection between Lulav and Hallel is a din in Lulav, which means that it's a further expression of Simchas Hareg. The Hallel, of course, is based on Simchas. The Rabbi used to say in the name of Reb Chaim that Reb Chaim was very marked. People have different practices. Number one, when they, are no-tel Lulav in the morning, some people go to their sukkah. And some people, there's reason makdimin, they do it as early as possible. But obviously, if you understand the Rambam this way, the preferred way to do the Tilas Lulav is to wait till Hallel. But in addition to that, Chaim was makdid, apparently, not to be mafsik once he made the bracha on the Tilas Lulav till the end of Hallel. So he didn't think that the Tilas Lulav l'chud and then the bracha on Hallel and saying of Hallel l'chud, he thought that these were all integrated because that's how he understood the vision of the Rabbi. So of course, it's not a coincidence that in Parshas Re'eh, there are three in the Parsha of the Regalim. We have three expressions of Simcha. One with regard to Shabbos, and two, Samach v'Chagach v'Yisa'ach Sameach, in connection with Sukkot. Whether the second one is only Shmini Atzeres or also Shmini Atzeres, we'll leave for another time. And of course, in Emor, the only expression of Simcha is Usmachtem Lefnei Hashem Elokeichem Shivas Yomim. So it's basically three Sukkos, one Shavuos. Why no Pesach for another time? But in the end of the day, there's so much evidence that what's unique about Sukkah, and especially Sukkah B'Mikdash, is that it is the apex it is the ultimate way to crystallize the concept of Simchas Achad. So you have, 8 months Simcha Yisera, and on the contrary, you made Yom Hafachad, Yom Kippur, in Itzach, and then you have Sukkot. As I said before, I don't think it's just opposites and a contrast. I think, as the Ramban points out, in Parshas Emor, the Torah emphasizes Chodesh Hashvi, Chodesh Hashvi. Ramban says that affects even, the presentation a little bit, as if to say, all of the holidays in Chodesh Hashvi are interconnected. There is a process that begins at Rosh Hashanah. We can say in Elul, Rosh Hashanah certainly, Aseret Yimei Tshuva. I always like to point out the language of the Chazal, Asara Yamim Shebein Rosh Hashanah L'Yom HaKippurim, which mathematically can't be correct, right? But the idea is that, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are both independent chagim, and they're also part of a process. They're the first and 10th day, and they're also kind of the 10 days. There's a process which proceeds, and that process doesn't finish at Yom Kippur. The last information we have about Yom Kippur, according to the Gemara's interpretation on Yom Daf Peyal from the base, the words Shabbat Shabbaton Lachem V'Nisim Esnav Shoseichen, but Tisha L'Chodesh Me'erev Ad Erev Tishbesu Shabbatchem is about Tosefes Yom Kippurim. It's about extending V'Nisem a little bit into the next day, as if to say this transition isn't a sharp one, right? But it's one which integrates all of these ideas. And of course, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, the famous, minhag of Klal Yisrael, which is to begin building a sukkah, right after Yom Kippur, which point out in the past, Shulchan Aruch actually repeats twice. The last halakha of Hilchos Yom Kippurim, and the first halakha of sukkah. Now again, if you look at the Mefarshim, they work hard to say, no, these are two different points. But you can't forget from one to the other because it's the next, sif. Whatever the 2 points are, they probably could have been integrated, into either one or the other. I think at least psychologically, if not intentionally, and maybe even intentionally, what the Shulchan Aruch was trying to say was Yom Kippur must inexorably lead to Sukkot. Otherwise, the year of the Fachad and all of that would be diminished. And Sukkot requires the background of Yom Kippur. The idea of Yira and the idea of Simcha, as different as they are, they share obviously their linchpins in Avodas Hashem, and they feed off each other in the same way that the Rambam in the beginning of Perek Beis, Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah, says that Ava and Yira feed off each other and really constitute two parts, of the same idea. As different as they are, that's how integrated they are as well. So on one level, Sukkot really emerges, as the necessary continuation of Yom Kippur. There are already foreshadow of Simcha on Yom Kippur, and there are remnants of Yira and Fachad on Sukkot. Particularly the way that Hoshana Rabbah emerged, not so much in the strict halacha, but certainly the way Klal Yisrael observes it, as a kind of second, Yom Kippur, like a last gasp. Even the way that we speak, Gemar Chasima Tova, we can say now, and then we say Gemar Tov until Hoshana Rabbah. So this entire period is all about, progression. And it's not a linear, straightforward progression. Anything that's complex, anything that reflects, a real transformation, has to kind of stop, and consolidate, different, benefits that have been accrued along the way and revisit them. And indeed, that is the process, that begins in Elul and that concludes at the end of Sukkot. So from that point of view, if the hallmark of Yom Kippur is V'Nisem, and the relationship between V'Nisem and Malach on Yom Kippur is a complicated relationship. The Gemara again in Yom Adap Pei Aleph and Aleph seems to go back and forth and back. And other halachos as well. Are they exactly identical and parallel? Is one more dominant than the other? But certainly in the presentation of the Psukim in Achrei Mos, Emor, in Pinchas, V'Nisem Esnav Shosechem, and in terms of what stands out, it's V'Nisem Esnav Shosechem. That is the critical, symbol, let's say, of Yom Kippur. And while again, it's not a negative, it's an opportunity. It is still a manifestation of inui, of self-affliction, of suppressing the physicality part, of our existence. And therefore, it's unsurprising that when it comes to Sukkot, not only do we have, this profusion of Simcha, but that the mitzvah of Sukkah itself and the mitzvah of Lulav, each, we're focusing on Sukkah now, also reflects that higher aspiration and the standard of Simcha. And that's why, in some respect, the words V'Nisem and the words Miztaer are connected. And Miztaer is simply incompatible with the more acute manifestation of Simcha that is intended, to be integrated with and a contrast, because it's a contrast to, or a transition from the Yira and the Paka. And from that point of view, there's a special din of Cholishin Sakana. These are concentric circles, who heim umisham sheyen. And there's another din, even more mechudash in a way, that Miztaer is Petur min hasukah. From that point of view, it's very possible that Miztaer is defined by the individual in question. Meaning, if he cannot muster, or if there's something about his circumstance, which doesn't properly, or doesn't, have the capacity to engender simcha, then that's an internal problem in Hilchos Sukkah, not a triage issue, in the broader world of, clashes in halacha. So that is one perspective. Yeah.
Does this assume a different source for fire than Tishrei, or it's saying within that?
No, I'm saying that I'm going to talk about Tishrei to do it right now, but I'm saying that would be true if the reason that Miztaer was Petur was directly linked to Simchas Yom. Now, if you want to say that that's what is meant by Tishrei Kein Taduru, it's possible, but I think Tishrei Kein Taduru likely, again, I think people use it different ways, but in its more distinctive, formulation, as I'll explain in a moment, I think that means something else.
And are there parts that could not Tishrei, but rather?
Yes, I mean the Ramban in his Perush on Torah uses this expression that others have noted. Simcha. I'm sorry, Ezrach. The Ramban says Ezrach Ra'anan. Many Achronim think that's what he's kind of referring to, and we'll see in a moment that Tishrei Kein Taduru. The Taz doesn't accept this view, but the Taz doesn't like the view of Tishrei Kein Taduru. So let's get to Tishrei Kein Taduru. So the first perspective is that Miztaer is a direct consequence of the more acute role that Simcha plays, and kind of a foil for the V'nisem in particular, and certainly that explains a lot of phenomena. I'll get to some nafkamina, of course, in a minute as well. The second perspective is the one that you just mentioned, and that is the perspective of the Bali Tosis, and Rajba, and others. Tosis in Sukkah, on Daf Chav Vav Amud Aleph, this is on page 3, the second last entry. Hoche Jochim Bayom. Tosis says, Kol Zeh, Tosis was troubled by exactly what we're troubled. Where all of a sudden, when it comes to Sukkah, you have all these, very, liberal, exemptions. You also have very extreme chumras, which is also fascinating. How much effort you have to make to be in the sukkah. I think they're two sides of the same coin. But Tosas explains, all of this is a consequence. The Torah says, Basukos Teishvu, and the limud is Ke'ein Taduru. Kishem Sh'adam Bebeso, Eino Nimna Milatze Saderach. Just like if you're home, right, and you have to go on a trip, you go. The Kein Miztaer, the Patrul El Menasukah, Hainu Miteshu Kein Taduru, the Ein Adam Dar, the Makom Shemitztaer. Like if your home was filled with insects, or the heat wasn't working, or the roof was leaky, but you wouldn't stay there. I wouldn't say you go to Florida at this point, but I guess you go to California. Yeah. What?
Yeah.
What kind of today? Michol is different. Oh, you're saying because then you have to have the benefit. Well, and sometimes people are more comfortable inside than outside. But yeah, that would be. So, what is the concept? If I understand what you're saying, that's 100% correct. If it's Teishvu Ke'ein Taduru, well, there can be two perspectives in Teishvu Ke'ein Taduru. Let me say it this way. One is that you have to, this is part of the larger topic, so I'm not going to get into it now, I'll just mention it. The sukkah is about changing your headquarters, in my view. You live in your home normally, and on sukkahs, you you live in the sukkah. And maybe what constitutes a proper home is defined by the kind of home that you would tolerate, under other circumstances. And from that point of view, Teshvu Ke'im Taduru is a shiur in the dira. And therefore, even if you don't have a better situation, that might be true, that even if you don't have a better situation, still the Chetza Shel Sukkah is not a Chetza Shel Sukkah, right? If it doesn't meet standards, that parallel a dira. That's one way to explain Teshvu Ke'im Taduru, in which case it has to do, as I say, with the Chetza Shel Sukkah. I'll get back to that in a minute. There's another possibility, and that is that this din of Teshvu Ke'im Taduru is certainly the way most Rishonim understood it, most of the Acharonim certainly, is a din in the mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah. It's not a way of gauging the sukkah and the quality of that alternative home. It has to do with the mitzvah of living in the sukkah. This living in the sukkah is gauged by, the kind of conduct, that you would exhibit in your home. So if it starts to rain, or if there are, bugs there, etc., you're not going to stay there. You're not going to. If you do stay, then you're not fulfilling Teshvu Ke'im Taduru. That doesn't necessarily mean that the sukkah, is compromised. And here, one would think that the alternative is critical. In other words, if you don't benefit, by leaving, because whatever is the source of your Miztaer, right, is unaffected by your change of venue, so then there will be no Petur, according to that perspective. And indeed, this is the view of the Or Zarua. Let me see if I can find that here. 1 second. It should be on page. It's also quoted in Shulchan Aruch from the Mordechai. If you look here on page 4, I believe I have the Or Zarua somewhere here as well. The last two, the last line. The Eina Miztaer Petur ela imi notzel atzmo b'natzah. Aval b'lav hachi chayiv leishiv b'sukkah afal gav the Miztaer. Right? If he doesn't benefit, again, if Teshvu Ke'im Taduru is a shiur in the makom, that isn't necessarily true. But if it's a din in yeshiva b'sukkah, then it's very possible, that it's gauged by the alternative. So, for example, there's a whole discussion. Rama also quotes, it's the position of the Uraim. Again, I have the Agos Oshri, I believe, here as well, somewhere. Do I? Again. If I can't find, here it is. Agos Maimunio, Sukkah Shofar. The Sukkah, this is on page 3. Kosav Re'im, that's the Rabbi Lazar Nimitz, the Uraim. Sheyitin alibo v'yisharim ha'yotze mibeso mipnei tzar kazeh rashai lotzes misukasa. So then in yeshiva b'sukkah, and it's two. The dafka, and then he adds the dafka she'osa sukaso mitchilaso b'mokom sharoi lecha v'lisha. Nolad lo atzar acharkach. He builds a sukkah in a place where there's no Miztaer, all things being equal, and then later a problem arises. All of a sudden, thieves come to town. All of a sudden, bugs. Invade. Aval masam mitchil b'makom haroi le'instayr b'achilo b'shtio b'sheina k'gon sheyari miganavim, right? Lo miboid lo miftar b'hachi ala pilo acha b'shasa b'yashem v'leyatzei dechovaso do ke'ein taduru be'ina. So this aspect of ke'ein taduru is not just based on the alternatives at the moment, but it's a shiur in the makom. Okay, and therefore, if you build it in a place where there's going to be a Petur Miztaer b'shaito, that doesn't give you a Petur, right? Number one, but it's also not a sukkah. That has nothing to do with Simchas Yom. This is a totally different perspective, but within Teshvu Ke'im Taduru, the ha lo hava ke'ein dira. So we don't have time right now, but if you look carefully at the Mefarshim, we've shown them already. And then the Mefarshim go with the perspective that Miztaer is based on Teshvu Ke'im Taduru. as I say, you see very clearly these two perspectives. One is that it has to do with yeshiva b'sukkah and a Petur. The other that it has to do with the hagdara of what a sukkah is as being gauged or measured by one's own. In this respect, one could be mechalek, even though for some reason a lot of the Mefarshim, and especially the Achronim, do not, and some of the Rishonim as well, between Miztaer and Geshem. Many Rishonim put them together. Many Achronim certainly put them together in both degrees. There are Gemaras speak about Miztaer, and there are certain rules that emerge as we've been discussing. And then there are discussions about Geshem. And if you assume that Geshem is just an acute form of Miztaer, so all these rules are combined together. However, in my opinion, if you look carefully in the Mishnayos and the Gemara, Geshem is treated differently and separately than Miztaer. And this is true in the Rambam as well. So, for example, two different Mishnayos. I'm just going to zero in for the moment on the Rambam, but I think picking up on a lot of the Gemaras. If you look on page 3, the Rambam says, the Rambam deals with these halachos in two different places. Like Perik Vav, Hilchos Shofar Halacha Beis. Let me go that one first, the one on top. He says, Cholim Mishamsheim Pturim Min HaSukkah. It's a Ptur. It's an exemption. V'lo chol sheyesh b'sakana afilu chosh b'rosha afilu chosh b'einav Miztaer Patur Min HaSukkah. Uvelo Mishamshav Eza Miztaer Shel Yochal Lishon B'pnei Ruach Mezvuvim. He speaks about internal problems. So how does the Rambam explain Miztaer? It's in Halacha Beis, and it's a Petur. What does he say about Geshem? That's already in Halacha Yud, which is far from Halacha Beis. Yordu Geshamim. He doesn't say Hareza Patur. He says, and this is actually very faithful to the language of the Mishnah and the Gemara, but it's even clearer because the Rambam is codifying. Hareza Nichnas L'toch HaBayis. There's a certain greater, not exempt. He goes into the house. And this is again a quote from the Brisa. Me'emasar mutar lefanos. Now the word lefanos is a strange word. Dagos Ashri, it's not for now, but just for a second, says lefanos means lefanos kela, meaning evacuate. You dismantle the sukkah. Not everybody else understands it that way, but the language of lefanos, even if you're just extricating yourself and not dismantling the sukkah, has a certain greater urgency, as if staying there is, meaningless or worse, right? There's a shear for Geshem. There's no shear for Miztaer, for better or for worse. Right? Then there's another halacha, the Gemara. This halacha appears in the Gemara. Ram codifies it, Shulchan Aruch codifies it, meaning if you go in, because of rain, and it stops raining, right, for whatever, you're involved with, you're sleeping, so you fell asleep, or it's nighttime, you're eating inside, right? You don't have to keep checking, it stopped raining, we'll go out for the third course, or the fifth course, right? You're exempt. Is there such a halacha? Let's say you're in Miztaer. Let's say there are bugs in the sukkah, or whatever case of Miztaer, and it stops. So many of the Achronim, many of the poskim assume that whatever is true for Geshem is true for Miztaer, because one is just a function of the other, and so on. But the halacha of you get an extended. You're eating inside, you're good. You're sleeping inside, for this tkufa of zman, there's no requirement of sukkah. It doesn't appear at all. So if what we might say is that, the Mishnah says that the problem of Geshem is a problem of Kiton Shamayim. It's like, the Rabboni Shalom is giving you a sign, get out of the sukkah. I'm not happy with it. But to read the signs that way, but there's no discussion of Miztaer is a very remarkable halacha. The Gemara never says Minalon. Right? That's why Tosas you said about Tishrei came to do it, because we're all familiar. At least it's a puzzle. Right? Does everybody have to? No, Tosas came up with that. It's the Gemara didn't even ask Miztaer Petur Minalon or Chola She'emo Sakana, Petur Minalon. Somehow whichever perspective they took, their deep understanding of the mitzvah of sukkah made this obvious. Geshem, they needed a bit more of an explanation. Kiton Shammai. One of my sons, a Bigdar, particularly likes there's a very interesting discussion of the Chachma Shlomo, Shlomo Kluger, and Shulchan Aruch. He always says very fascinating things. So he has this discussion. He says, let's say it's raining. It's raining in the neighborhood, and it's not raining in your sukkah. Not because you have a thicker schach. For some reason, it's like the Rabboni Shalom's, I don't know, he's protecting you, whatever it is. So he initially thinks that you go inside, that you're part of a sukkah, that if you made a bracha, it would be a bracha levatala. There's no Miztaer. You're having a very enjoyable, but it's raining in the neighborhood. I think that's very mechudash. But you can't even begin to say that if you think that Geshem is Miztaer. So there are those who think that Miztaer is Geshem, meaning that if you, and there are those who think that Geshem is Miztaer. But what I think is, for the Rambam, that Geshem is really a din in the Chefza Shel Sukkah. Meaning, either the Maisa of Yeshiva Sukkah, or maybe even the status of Sukkah itself is compromised by that. Miztaer is a Petur Gavra, whether it's Midin Simchas, Sukkah, or Teshlu Keim Taduru. And I believe that these are correct nafkamina. And there are other nafkamina too. Again, there's a major debate whether or not the Petur of Miztaer and Geshem apply on the first night of Sukkot. Just one more second. That's a big debate. The Gemara says that, Tesvav. We have a connection between, the first night of Sukkot, first night of Pesach. So, therefore you have to eat. It's even a great, the other days it's Ibayachal, Ibayloyachel. If you're not eating, a Suda Kavua, you could eat, but the first night you have to eat. So the Rishonim all debate. Rishonim Brachos, Sukkah. What about Geshem and Miztaer? And it happens, of course. There's a huge debate. The Bali Tosas and Brachos say it doesn't matter. Even Geshem, you eat in the sukkah on the first. And other Rishonim say, absolutely not. So the Chuvas HaRashba, as a Chuba, which he says, he compares Geshem and Miztaer, and he says, you're not going to fulfill any mitzvah, even if it's raining. Whether you should wait around till the rain stops, that's a different question. That's a second question. The Gra in Orachayim in Siman Taf Reish Lamed Tes, Sivkat and Chapes, when he quotes this Chuvas HaRashba, he reformulates what he says. At least with respect to Geshem, he says, the Rashba says it's not a sukkah anymore. So he doesn't, if you look at the Chuvas HaRashba. But it's very interesting. Meaning you could say, in this question, that there's a difference between Geshem and Miztaer. Geshem, there's no Shem Sukkah, or there's no Maisa Yeshiva B'Sukkah. Miztaer is a Petur. Teshlu Keim Taduru. There's a whole discussion, the Oneg Yom Tov, the famous Shuba, where he says, if you sit and eat in the sukkah when it's raining, or Miztaer, maybe you should be violating the Isur Hanav, getting Hanav from the Atzei Sukkah, when it's inappropriate. And this caused a very big stir, in the Achronim. But what you could say, is that if there's a problem in Chafsa Shel Sukkah, then this is a serious problem, maybe. But if it's a Petur Gavra, but there is a shame Sukkah, maybe not. Yerushalmi says, famously in Shabbos in a totally different context, that call a Petur and Adabar b'Yoseu nikra head. And the Orzarur, Ben Simcha, quotes this in connection with, sitting in the sukkah, in the context of Geshem, and then the Shulchan Aruch quoted it. Everybody thinks that that's what is written. It wasn't written about that, but that's how they apply. So is a person a head jote if he, sits in the sukkah in a state of Miztaer and Geshem? You might be mechale between Geshem and Miztaer. But either way, I know there's some questions. I'll take them. I'm running out of time. The idea that, either the place is defined by not being plagued by the problem of Miztaer, or what impact that has in terms of Baltosif or Isur Hana, or whether you equate Geshem and Miztaer, etc. All these depend on the two perspectives within Teshvu Ke'ein Todu. Yeah, you had a question, I think. You have me later? Okay, good. Let me talk about a third perspective, even because I have to run to give another share. The third perspective is based on the position of the Bach. And it is adopted with respect to Miztaer by his son-in-law, the Taz, who anyways is enamored, although he reformulates it, the Bach's idea. The Bach, very famously, really Rabbeinu Hananel, I think was the first to say this. We noted that one of the unique features in the Psukim, the second parsha of Sukkah, is the Tamei Mitzvos. Right? Leman yedu dorosechem ki b'sukkos hashaftis b'nei Yisrael b'otzi osam me'eretz Mitzrayim. That Leman yedu dorosechem is very interesting. So the Bach, Rabbeinu Hananel on the base in Sukkah wants to discuss the question of how high can the schach be, and the question whether or not you have to be contemplating the schach. He makes allusion to this idea, and the Bach certainly became famous for it because he expands it in a very significant way. The Bach, at the very beginning of his Perush on the Torah, the Sukkah discusses, Anane HaKavod, Sukkos Mamish, what the debate about what it is that we're celebrating, what is the nace of Sukkah, and why that matters, basically. So what he says is that since the Torah says it puts extra emphasis and makes more demanding the consciousness, and the kavanah that you are required to have in Sukkah. Now there are different formulations, and the Bach says it a little bit differently than the Taz and others. Is it that everybody agrees here that mitzvah strichos kavanah and it's ma'akev, or is it kavanah for the tamei hamitzvah? Very interesting things, but not for now. But the bigger idea is what the Bach is trying to suggest is that he says, you have a little bit of tefillin, which it's interesting that some people think that Miztaer might apply also to tefillin in light of this. But there are a few other places in the Torah where you have a parallel to Leman Yedu Dorosechem. And the Bach says, whenever you have that, the role of kavanah is far more meh. That's the Bach. The Taz, with this I'll have to finish off pretty much, but then I want to take a blast for another minute. If you look at the Taz here, Taz addresses the question of Abel. As we said before, the Gemara Havamina, that Abel would be Petur Mizdim Miztaer, right? Even though nothing to do with the environment in Sukkah, and then the Gemara says, no. Miztaer is Miztaer Divinei. But here, Iboy, right? Yisuve died. He has to get over it. And we don't know what that means. And different Mefarshim understood it in different ways. Some understood it to mean simply, it's Teshvu Ke'ein Toduru. Is how the Rosh understood it, although with a very big finish. Meaning, what defines Miztaer is the discrepancy between, the discomfort of being in the sukkah, and the better alternative of being at home. And that's what you mean by Miztaer D'Mimela. And that doesn't apply to Avelis, because so what was the Havamina? So the Rosh says a bit of a chiddush. The Rosh says the Havamina was that he would rather be at home than in the sukkah, because he's focused on his loss. And this gets the social environment of the sukkah, having to be in the sukkah, chat with everybody, be a raconteur, the sukkah, discussions, is difficult for him in his state of mind. So the Taz is a very interesting discussion regarding Avelis. Let's look at this for a minute. It's on page 4. You see Taz Orachaim Simon Top Reishman. Avachai B'Sukkah, the Gemara Parchinam Pshita. Thou the same whole V'Amar Rabbi Miztaer Patum LaSukkah Hainami Miztaer. Kamash. Daf Getzar Demimela Aval Hacha Iu Kamitzar Iboili Suvedai. Pirush Harosh. The Havaminu the Avel Miztaer B'Sukkah Yosef Mimabayis. He's more uncomfortable in the sukkah. The Avel Chafetz Lios Mitbodeid V'Yoshev B'Makom Tzar. He has to outlet his pain. The Kasha, Nehete Salomar Svara Garua Kazos. This is the task. Shazeh Nechshab La'avel Litzar B'Meshal Yochel Litzar. He's pain. It's a fascinating discussion about Avelos, right? The Rosh is saying, he needs sometimes to wallow, not even wallow. He needs to outlet, to manifest in his grief. The Taz says, what kind of business is that? He's upset because he wants to be more upset. Even better. The Imkene also Nacham Avelim. Right? Nicham Avelim is more torture. So of course the answer is, in some respect it is, and it's still therapeutic, and it's important for him as a process. It's complicated. Anyways, the Taz sees it as one-dimensional. It is or it isn't. The Komitzar and also Shaliuchal Miztaer. Assume knowledge is as far a cloud. Amaylo Mishani the Ba'avel Eila Malam Babayis Yosef Misukah. We're not just saying, the Avel's not benefiting because Teshru came to Aduru is always measured by the alternative. And here there's no alternative. He doesn't get any better in the house. Kalahavamina, keeping the Torah part of the sukkah. So Taz says, I have a different job. Kamashlo the Kain Dira Be'inan below Petur Ellen Kaini not sell the outside. Maybe the Havamina was he's preoccupied. And the Maskana is, yeah, but he still doesn't do any better at home. But Lomalo Lakalik thinks hard to be Melo low. Elomar Dezaya Pashut Labala Talmud, Dana Tamishim Tirdo, Kinamin and Shom the Suyalin and Kriyashma, the oven. Elaniata Tabasa Spina Savayan, Okanamin and Potter, a Miztaer Potter of the Kain Dirabina, Al Korka Parakan, but Abel Pshita, the Chayev, Shri Efshal, he not sell Miatza. Tirzo Tartson, Sheshkan Svaral, he not sell the Nichal of his bonus Kadibra Rosh. In case Lovely Lakalik, being Sard the Mimelo. I'm just going through this quickly because you get the idea. The Eshkan Chilik La'avel, the actually not so much Sar, Zo Ikra Teretz. Bimnomer Adra, MSK, David Star Potter, in a double Toli Biochali not sell, and Mishum Tirda Potter. Afagav the Bashar Mitzaslo Ichbaslam Batorin Bitzar. Normally, we wouldn't care that a person is preoccupied and he can't concentrate and he can't, focus. Kirabina Begamara. Right? Sukkah shiny. The Taz says, I don't think it's Kain Taduru. I think the reason Miztaer is Patur min Sukkah is because you need a certain level of awareness and concentration and appreciation for what you're doing. Kamasha Kasa. Imkain Shapir, Mishani, Kivanatam, Mishum Tirda, Havamina, the Gamba Avel, Yesh Tirda the Tzara. Kamashmun Dafka Mimela, right? Aval Avel Ena Bechal Miztaer Niftor min Sukkah. And then he goes on, I'm not going to read the whole thing. The view of the Taz, as he continues to explain it, is that the Petur of Miztaer, and it's not because of Teshru came to Duru, it's because Leman Yedu Dorosechem, Ki v'sukkot hashaftis b'nei Yisrael tzio Sunday. Eretz Mitzrayim requires a certain acute level of awareness and appreciation. That, of course, changes the whole equation in terms of how you read that Gemara. What about Akaza Saddam? Other nafkamina as well. My time's up. I have to run. So let me just take a step back for a moment. We noted that, began by saying that Miztaer, Patur Sukkah, seems to be a very mechudash halakha. And that's why, we showed them in the poskim, they're all addressing it. They're trying to define it, they're trying to limit it, they're trying to expand it, whatever the case, may be. And there's no Gemara that's very shocking, I think very telling. The Gemara says Miztaer minol, or Kol Hashem Basakana minol. That would be, that would be an expectation. That's what you'd have anticipated. It's not there. Obviously, this is a crucial halacha that is organic to the definition of sukkah. And what emerges in our analysis, and there's many other nafkamina, is that there are three, basic approaches with nuances within that we don't have time to develop. One is that this is a function of acute simchas haregel, and in that respect, of course, it represents, as I say, part of a process, a contrast, a parallel, but really the culmination of all of the holidays of Tishrei. And it's very important, even as we, prepare to immerse ourselves, in the year of Afachad, of Yom Kippur. I mentioned before, I like the language of the Rambam in Perush Mishnayos. He says, these are days of year of Afachad, mimenu u'mivrach u'manos elav. It's important to understand that the yira, as much as it, engenders the trepidation that it should, that its goal is not greater distance, but a greater sense of reliance to take refuge in the Rebbeinu Shalom. And it's important to understand that B'Nisim, as difficult and challenging as it physically is for people, right, is intended really to be a way of self-sacrifice, for sure, that's one aspect, but also, as I say, a way of elevating them and establishing their credentials, establishing that we can out malachim the malachim if we have to, and that therefore, for the rest of the year, we can live a balanced life, not as a b'diavad, but as a chatchila, and that we can transition seamlessly the chedva from Shabbos Shabboson into the holiday of Sukkot, which is the most acute Yom Tov of Simcha on so many levels. Ad kedei kach that Miztaer is Petur, even without a makar, it's just incompatible with what Sukkot is all about. By the same token, the second perspective of Teshvu Ke'im Taduru really highlights, again, this process. There's nothing more unique and singular, as I say, than Yom Kippur. And really, we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, but the centerpiece of Yom Kippur is the Avodah. And Klal Yisrael would gather in the Azara, and the Kohen Gadol would preside. And it wasn't the day of Ke'im Taduru. Everything about it was different than usual. Nisem and the Isur Malacha is a different basis. Ki Yom Kippurim l'chaper alechem, Lifnei Hashem titaharu. So the idea that, you could get the impression that that's the ideal. And that, again, life, Ke'im Taduru, the shigra, the routine of life, is, a b'diavad. It's a mediocre, formula. So we have immediately kind of in the transition, once we've been able to establish our Yom Kippur, credentials, being in the Azara, being Koreo, Mishtachada, while the Kohen Gadol is Nichnas, Lifnai, Lifnim, we have this glorification of Teshvu Ke'im Taduru, where the Chefza B'Sukkah and the Yeshiva B'Sukkah are literally defined, by what otherwise seems like Shigra, but in the context of being able to accomplish Yom Kippur is really the ideal of living in a home, living in a community. Teshvu ke'ein taduru. And then finally, what we're being told is that understanding this transition and appreciating it so that there's no letdown from Yom Kippur. On the contrary, right? There's an ascent from it, and integrated with it, there always has to be kavanah to say it. There has to be an awareness of what we're doing. And even the normal rules, whether it's a mitzvah strichas kavanah or of misase, those standards are insufficient to fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkot. If we really want to understand why it's important to have simcha yisera, the mikdash, that's also, the mikdash part is also part of the Yom Kippur reaction, and big vulin. And if we understand why ke'ein taduru is really something to emulate, and something to strive for, to aspire to, the only way that we can do that is leman yedu dorasechem kiva sukkos hashafti as bnei Yisrael, by really being focused, by being aware, by elevating our sense of kavanah. So even as we move into Yom Kippur, and I want to wish everybody a Gemara Chasima Tova, I say, it might seem peculiar to be, jumping the gun and speaking about Sukkot, but not really, at all. A deeper understanding of what Sukkot is based on a deeper appreciation of what Yom Kippur is, and really we can, feel a great sense of privilege, that is, Kichelak Hashem Amo Yaakov Chevel Nachal Aso, that this process of Chodesh Tishrei, is given to us, so that we can feel these different experiences in a very acute way. Lahadil Torah.